The issue of Crimea is one of the most complex in the post-Soviet space, and it still causes many contradictions between Ukraine and Russia. The issue escalated in 2014 when Crimea was annexed by Russia, which was not recognized by the international community. However, Crimea itself became part of Ukraine not so long ago, only in 1954, thanks to Khrushchev. And in this video, I will tell you why Khrushchev handed over Crimea to Ukraine and what were the reasons for this. At the beginning, let's talk briefly about how the transfer of Crimea took place. The transfer of Crimea from Soviet Russia to Soviet Ukraine took place on February 19, 1954, by decision of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. Traditionally, it's believed that this issue was initiated by Khrushchev, although at that time Khrushchev did not yet have a preponderance in power, and Malenkov played an important role. Anyway, the transfer of Crimea was approved by the authorities, so that the Crimean region was transferred to Ukraine. Crimea gained autonomy within Ukraine only in 1991. And so let's move on to the main question. Why was Crimea transferred to Ukraine? There are different explanations for this. Let's discuss some of them. The reason, which is often called the 300th anniversary of the Pereyaslav Rada, which marked the union of Ukraine, represented by the Hetmanate and the Russian Kingdom. The Pereyaslav Rada was signed in 1654, and its initiator was Bogdan Khmelnytsky. So the transfer of Crimea is often explained as a gift to Ukraine for loyalty to Russia, despite the fact that in honor of the 300th anniversary of the Pereyaslav Rada, magnificent parades were indeed held in the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the holiday itself was hardly a significant reason for the transfer of lands. Moreover, the leaders of that time did not even talk about it. The documents on the transfer of Crimea did not mention the Pereyaslav Rada. The second reason became popular largely due to Putin's statement. Namely, he claims that the transfer of Crimea was connected with Khrushchev's desire to enlist the support of the Ukrainian nomenclature and to make amends for organizing mass repressions in Ukraine in the 1930s. On the one hand, there really was an internal party struggle between Khrushchev and Malenkov in those years, and perhaps such a decision could help Khrushchev in this. Although at the same time, these actions could turn other members of the CPSU away from themselves. As for making amends, in the context of the Soviet leaders of the one-party system, it sounds meaningless and not convincing. The leaders then did not have to fight for the electorate and loyalty. The third reason is often called the artificial creation of contradictions within the public to undermine national movements. In our case, we're talking about Ukrainian nationalism. Some researchers note that Soviet leaders purposely attach regions to the majority of Soviet republics, which someday could claim to be separated from the republics on a national basis. This was done to leverage pressure on the republics, if they wanted more rights or to withdraw from the Union altogether. And this happened with Crimea, whose population at the time of accession was predominantly Russian, which would create tension in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Similar things are observed in other republics of the Union. The same Karabakh inhabited by Armenians, which is part of Azerbaijan, as well as Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which is part of Georgia. All these regions after the collapse of the Soviet Union became points of conflict between post-Soviet countries, and the same thing happened with Crimea. The fourth reason is called economic reasons, and it's one of the most rational. So in principle, this is fixed in the decree on the transfer of Crimea. The need for the transfer of the peninsula is explained by the common economy, territorial proximity, and close economic and cultural ties between the Crimean region and the Ukrainian SSR. The economy of Crimea in 1954 was not in the best position. Despite the fact that the war ended 9 years ago, the restoration of the Crimea was rather slow. This was caused by the fact that Crimea came under German occupation, and there were active hostilities initially during the seizure of Crimea by the Germans. and then during its liberation by the Red Army. Because of this, entire cities were almost wiped off the face of the earth. Another important factor was the reduction of the population of the Crimea. Firstly, due to the loss of life caused by the fighting, the western part of the Union suffered the most. Secondly, because of the deportation of Crimean Tatars, who, according to 1939, were about 20% of the population of Crimea. That means that a fifth of the population was evicted. As for territorial proximity, this factor was extremely important, since almost all raw materials, resources, equipment, and so on were supplied either from the territory of Ukraine or, in any case, passed through transit through Ukrainian lands. Purely geographically, the Crimean Peninsula was in close connection with continental Ukraine. The issue of freshwater, which is practically not existent on the peninsula, has always been critical for Crimea, because supplies have always been carried out from the Dnieper. Thus, the Soviet leadership, motivating everything with rational goals, decided to transfer Crimea to Ukraine for a more consistent division of lands and simplification of economic ties. At that time, the Soviet government did not even think about the possible separation of the republics from the Union, because the very question of whether the region belonged to any republics was not so important. All the same, the regions remained part of the Soviet Union, and control over all lands was carried out from Moscow. In general, it was not uncommon for the Soviet Union to change the borders of existing republics. Such process took place quite regularly. It's even worth remembering that the Soviet Union itself was created by 4 republics and eventually broke up into 15.